I am Dr. Rubina Jasani, and I'm based at the University of Manchester. Um, I'm joined by Dr. Fazila Bhimji, and who is based at the University of Lancashire, and she will introduce herself, and she will also introduce her colleague who is based in Germany, who has been collaboratively doing some work with her. I have been working with WAST, Women Asylum Seekers Together. I had a collaborative research project, and I have also been associated with Safety for Sisters. Today, we are joined by one of the deputy directors, one of the directors of Safety for Sisters, Sandhya Sharma, who will also introduce herself after Jennifer introduces herself, and tell us a little bit about the work of the organization. Over to you, Fasila.
Thank you, Rubina. As Rubina mentioned, my name is Fazila Bhimji, and I'm based at the University of Central Lancashire. Very soon I will be teaching in the area of community leadership. And I have done, in the last few years, I've been doing research with activists in Berlin. And I've had the pleasure to know the founders of International Women's Space since as early as 2013, end of 2013. And I would like to introduce and talk a little bit about International Women's Space and their wonderful work. They've been involved in anti-racist and political struggles, and have been actively working for the rights of women, international women, Black women, displaced women since then. And actually they formed a very integral part of the refugee resistant movement in 2012-13. So it's an amazing organization, and Jennifer is one of the co-founders of this incredible group. And more recently, they last year or so, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, with very small funding, with very limited funding, actually, they started this subgroup called Break Isolation Group, which is a self-organized refugee women's working group, and it's formed out of, they describe it as being formed out of the urgent need for political organization by and for refugee women in and out of the German asylum system. And they have this amazing and incredible website which lists and describes the everyday realities of women as and how they're experiencing during COVID. And I will let Jennifer speak on the methodology and a little bit about the podcasts and the way they, receive these messages, and let her talk a little bit about the experiences of the women as well during COVID, as they found through this, through the activism. So over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you very much, Fazila, for the introduction. I'm going to introduce Malitza here. She's part of the Break Isolation Group. Mm-hmm. And she's one of the women who is sending the voice messages about the situations in the Heim. As Fazila already introduced, in the movement of 2012, there were things that we were fighting as the migrant group. There was the Residenzpflicht. Residenzpflicht was a law that dictated once you're registered in one land, you're not allowed to move to the other land. We were fighting a voucher system. In the asylum system, the money you get to support your everyday living came in a form of voucher, which was very dehumanizing because you went to the supermarket with that voucher, and if the voucher was in a denomination of 20 euros, you had to calculate commodities to the amount of 20 euros. Because if you went with not the equivalent, the cashier was not allowed to give you any change back. And this was very dehumanizing because that's where the society started thinking these refugees are crazy people, That was that. And then there was where the Heims were located, it still is very far from the train station. Then we had no right to learn the German language, even though every asylum letter came in very high German language. We had no permission to work. So these are the things that we are fighting for. And just to cut the long story short, then there was the occupation of the Gert Hauptmann Schule, where we carved out a women's space. And in the end, from this movement, we were able to fight the law and have the Residenzpflicht abolished, and we had the voucher system abolished. And then with the incoming of the 2015, then there was the integrations concept, which came as a result of what we were fighting for, to integrate into the society. Right. And in 2019, when I started the foundation, I was also an asylum seeker. So we continued to go in this way. So in 2019, when things began to change after the year of migration, 2015, then we thought there was a need to form a group only for refugee women to kind of to politicize what exactly is happening in the asylum. And this is how we came about with the Break Isolation Group. So what happened was we organized ourselves and started visiting the Heims. We took ourselves to the camps so that we can get into contact with the women, furnish them with the most vital, necessary information to assist them in the hiding. So come 2019, we started this project. 2020, then came the lockdown, which meant we could not go to the Heims and they could not come to us. We have an office, so it meant there was no way. And as refugees, always they are the last people to get the necessary information. May it come from the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Health, they are always the last people to get information. And as it was a difficult time, everybody was very afraid of COVID-19, but nobody wanted to include or think of the fear of the women living in the Heims. And by the fact that they were geographically displaced because of where the Heims are, then we called it a double isolation, because then there was the official lockdown, and then there was a situation of living in isolated Heims. So we had to find a way of keeping the communication live, understanding what was happening in these shelters. Because then, even when there was a basic information from the Ministry of Health of sanitizing, wash your hands, cover your mouth, this information, they got it, they were the last people to get it. So we were afraid that in that situation of COVID, there will be no information from these lagers, from these Heims. So we initiated the lager reports. And these lager reports was simply a woman recorded the information that in the Heim she lived in, the home she basically is calling her home place to stay. And she gave us detailed information of everything that was happening in that Heim. So we received this information via WhatsApp. And then, because of there's always fear when people are in the asylum system, because they think they will be victimized if they share certain information. So we changed the voice of the person so that nobody could identify who the voice came from, and then shared this information on all of our social medias, all on our website, on everything. So that was the only way that we could keep the information circulating. And this is how we have been consistently. Maybe Malitza, you want to add on the situation of the camps as a person now who is living there?
Right. So there's always like an information black hole where you find that people who are living in this, what we call Heims, which is homes, they never get to receive this information. And I don't know if I can stress that enough, like what Jennifer was trying to say. So you find that you are put in this position where this information is not being given to you. And if you don't have this information, there are repercussions which you could face. You understand? So like in Berlin, there is laws, or in Germany at large, where you need to have a face mask or face covering when you're entering the train station, when you're even in certain public spaces. And there is no consistent and there is no coherent passing of information. So people usually don't understand, and you don't know who to ask. And there is also the fact that you're also going through an asylum process. So you don't know if you're being dealt the correct cards or there's something that is happening behind the scenes that you're not able to understand. So that is why at IWS it also goes far and beyond to be able to help people who don't have this information, and you direct them on the right path so that they are able to get it. Because as an asylum seeker, somehow you always feel like you've lost your credibility. And when you speak in public, people don't understand what you're saying. So if there is this uniformed passing of information from different himes all over Germany, from different states, and it's always, you can always draw a line, it leads back to the same thing. It helps to amplify the voices of these women. It helps to amplify the voices of these people who are running thinking they're coming to safety, and then they're bombarded with this sort of like situation they don't know how to deal with. And that is why when you're able to record your voice, you're able to detail your experience when you're living at the house, you feel like you are given somebody to speak to. You are given somebody where you can be able to open up and air out your frustrations, and get to know that there are people who will listen to this. And even if change doesn't come right now, change is on its way, because you're helping to get this information outside there.
And up to now, we are the only people who have been able to document what exactly was happening during the COVID time. Up to now, we are making serious follow-ups on who is accessing the vaccination and who is not able to access the vaccination and why. So there's a continuation of these audio reports.
Fazila.
No, so Rubina, I was wondering if you could, and your colleague from Safety for Sisters, perhaps if you could shed more of a, comparative light as to what's happening in Britain.
Yeah, so I'll say a little bit about my association with Safety for Sisters. Like I said in my introduction, that I've done a research project with WAST, which is Women Asylum Seekers Together. The project was basically about testing, peer ethnographic research methods, but I am also associated with migrant women in Manchester through Safety for Sister, and I work voluntarily on the board of trustees of the organization, and I've been associated with the organization for almost 4 years now. And the organization also had to, get into action in a very different way through COVID times, because people were asked to, we had a lot of spaces where women met together, and people were asked to move into isolation, and that had, of course, implications. I'm going to let Sandhya speak about, everything that we did. Sandhya, I also want you to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Rubina, and thank you all. And I was really, really impressed, really touched, and it's an honor to be listening to Jennifer and Melita talk about International Women's Space, fully sending solidarity to you all under such difficult situations, and absolutely with you in every step and every word that you were saying. And that's very much part of our background as well at Safety for Sisters, but we are different in some ways, and I'll explain some of those ways, but I'll talk about our specific sort of remit as well here in the north of England, in Manchester. We started in 2009, and we were born really out of the dire need for women's spaces to deal with BME migrant asylum-seeking women and create spaces of safety for them, which wasn't happening, but also within race politics, where women were largely absent and their voices largely silenced or underserved. And so what we were seeing was in both of the movements that we come from, the violence against women movements, the anti-deportation movements, but also the race movements and race equality, that migrant women's positioning was precarious at best, absent in most spaces. So we were carving out a space for those women, and it comes from a rights background, because those women are denied access to safety when they're experiencing violence and gender-based violence. And we see that consistently, that they are denied by the state, and that's punitive and that's purposeful. It is about as the UK government, and sharing with you, Jennifer and Melita, the German government. It's about if we stop and make it so horrible, and we create destitution and we create enforced poverty, then it will make it harder for people to come, or they'll be put off coming. Now, of course, it doesn't work like that, and we know why it doesn't work like that, because we come from a human rights background, right? So, but that is the government's sort of politic within England, and it's only getting worse. In fact, yesterday we heard about the asylum reform bill, and this is on the back of Brexit, on the back of a Home Office that has woken up in a very angry mood after COVID, really kicking back and saying, no, we're strong, we're tough on illegal immigrants. And this is the trope, this is the language used continually, and you will recognize it in international women's space: illegality, you're not welcome, you're only economic migrants, you have no rights. And that is the way that the English government and Westminster also deems people from abroad, and makes it extremely difficult. And when we're talking about displacement, I think it's really important to say there's multiple forms of displacement. One is geographical, and that is the main way through which the migrant journey and experience is framed. But also it's a displacement of emotions, a displacement of people, a displacement of community, a displacement, you were saying, Jennifer and Melita, of language, not even the colonial language, but mother tongue language. So it's a constant whittling down of that experience of the person, to deny them at every front, to displace them from their reality and from their journey. So Safety for Sisters was born because we were seeing that women were not getting the rights to safety, the rights to protection, the basic human rights and safeguarding rights that other British national women were receiving in the UK, and tried to, as you say, amplify that gap, but also to take action on that gap, and to actually try and provide services and support and assistance to those women. So practically, it's casework, it's supporting the women. Practically, it's giving emotional and group support. And practically, we launched, in the middle of COVID, we launched one of the very first refuges for migrant women with no recourse to public funds. And it's the recourse to public funds bit that's really important, because that means that the person cannot access welfare benefits from the state, pull down money from the state to support herself in housing away from violent abusers, and to subsist away from violent abusers. Without that public fund, women are left destitute if they leave the abuse, or they have to remain within the abuse. And it's that struggle that the state has consistently said, well, use the language of legality to excuse themselves from having to look at the human rights aspect. And also that has been co-opted by civil society and other NGOs now, because looking at borderings, there's place and there's displace. And if we think about the borders aren't just geographical. They aren't just starting, Little England or which country. They're not just national borders, but it's the borders of consciousness. So we see NGOs also becoming immigration officers and start saying, well, we can't provide a service because this person may well be illegal, or this person may well not have rights. Now that is creeping into even civil society that was supposed to pull that gap, and provide services that the state didn't. So we're seeing it increasingly become part of our national language and our national way of thinking about who has rights and who doesn't have rights. And the people who don't have rights are largely women from Black, migrant, minoritized communities, where so COVID has only exacerbated that, horrendously, and Jennifer and Melita experienced the same. It's been far worse for women, because no one. Look, the government didn't even think of women and domestic violence. They certainly didn't think about migrant women within those communities. So migrant women with no recourse to public funds were left out of the national dialogue, were left out of the emergency responses. And we at Safety for Sisters had to fight so hard to get to get the decision makers to acknowledge the existence of migrant women with no recourse to public funds, and acknowledge that their plight and their experience is going to be even worse than a British national, and it was bad for everyone. So we spend a lot of time trying to convince decision makers to listen to us, to get them to provide services. And when we do, and that we've had some successes, but a huge amount of disappointments and challenges, and the small successes, even they were short-lived. COVID also favored patriarchy and violent abusers, because without any repercussions, they were allowed to abuse women and abuse children, and there was very little to be done about that, because everyone was in lockdown. And certainly in Manchester, we had extended periods of lockdown because the virus was so prevalent in the north. And the fear also of, we were told it was, the virus was also raced. It was affecting disproportionately Black and minority ethnic communities, because they already are experiencing health inequalities due to a number of different factors, including bad housing, poverty, and historical inequality, as much as anything. So Safety for Sisters saw women suffering on all levels, really. And it was quite astonishing that, during one of the worst periods of time in our short lives at Safety for Sisters, that we were able to open a Bunch House, which is the dedicated refuge and sanctuary for BME women with no recourse to public funds, migrant women who are experiencing violence. And it's, that's something that we're incredibly proud of, against all odds. And the odds are huge, and they are stacked against us at every level. Running parallel, and I will stop in a minute, but running parallel to the year of COVID was the domestic abuse bill that was going through Parliament at the same time. Running parallel to COVID, and our experience was that the domestic abuse bill, which was set to strengthen the laws and strengthen the protections for women who are experiencing domestic abuse, absolutely failed in every element to recognise migrant women within that. Despite raising really good arguments, fantastic solutions, despite a big campaign effort on behalf of groups like Southall Black Sisters, Latin American Women's Rights Service, the Angelou Centre, and smaller groups like ours, despite pushing the voice and amplifying the experiences of migrant women and the human rights-based arguments for those women to be protected as well as British nationals, the government has still decided to exclude migrant women from the discourse, from the law. Again, we find ourselves outside of the remit of law, and of course, what we're asking for is for those women, for women to be seen within law, lawful. So a bit of a mixed bag. We have struggled on. We have pushed the agenda with some degree of success, but overall, in terms of the law, in terms of the environment in which women live, and the tone of the government, it is getting harsher and more punitive.
But basically, that's what we were saying, to politicize women and to make them understand what they live is for the politics of the day.
Absolutely. I couldn't say it better myself. And that's certainly what we try at Safety for Sisters as well, to create that space for politicization and the political voice. And the women are deeply political, because violence is political, migration is political, being a migrant, an immigrant is political, being a BME woman in the UK is political, moving borders is political, it's all political. And we try as much as the and I really liked hearing from you, Melita, about the big break isolation group. That's right, I wrote it down, because that's part of our work and purpose is to make sure that we're creating spaces of safety where women can meet, where women can talk, when women can be active politically, and where women can amplify and bring forward their own voices within not just Safety for Sisters, but in the wider struggle as well, because we are here because other groups are not. We are here because other groups are not, haven't got the politics or haven't got that voice or aren't providing that service and aren't upholding the rights of all the people, within this country. So that's, Safety for Sisters' purpose is not just purely practical and purely, to fill a gap. It is also a political taking up of space.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to say something on I think it's really important to talk about politicization and creating the space for for politics. But I think one of the things that, and Sandhya, correct me if I'm wrong, is one of the observations that we made when me and my colleague Jack Marie de Lopez were doing this work with WAST 2 years ago, was that there are limits to self advocacy, because, yeah, and there are political implications. So, yes, Safety for Sisters or organizations like WAST will create the space, but, you are representing yourself in a lot of these political spaces. And the fear is because you're an asylum seeker, you don't want to be seen. So, there's also that added layer of invisibility that comes in. And so there's limits for self advocacy, or limits to what women can do, just because of the nature of the asylum system, right? And that was one of the biggest thing that we realized. And one of the biggest thing we also we found ourselves liaising around, because the aim of the project was not only to look at, was to create a community of researchers, because as anthropologists we felt very strongly about the methodology that we use, and this whole idea of giving voice that we speak about methodologically. And we wanted to move away from that, and thought we wanted to experiment with a methodology called peer ethnography. And I think one of the things that we found ourselves also struggling with is the anger that women felt just with little things like accessing secondary healthcare, right? And I think it's really important, apart from just creating a political space. I think it's smaller organization also become lobbyist organization, because you're not only talking about the macro politics, but you're also really lobbying to bring about the smaller changes that are actually taking place at the ground level. Fazila, I was wondering whether you wanted to, we've not, it's very interesting to hear from both the grassroots organizations in Germany and England, and we've kind of not really spoken a lot about our own research and our own work with migrant groups. I was wondering whether you wanted to share something about your own research, and I was also thinking that we should probably speak a little bit about methodology, and this whole idea of co-research, and also the role of activism, yeah, as academics. Why do we feel the need to do this kind of research, which comes with a huge sense of social responsibility? Or why, to put it differently, why do certain academics feel that they have to do research that because many a times when it comes to methodology, the whole idea is that one has to, when it comes to ethics, one speaks about objectivity in a certain way. But my experience has been that when you do this kind of work, when you work intimately with migrant women or displaced populations, it's really difficult for us to speak about objectivity. And people, you do end up getting involved, and you end up taking you end up taking a kind of a public role. And I feel like my work with Safety for Sisters comes from that sense of responsibility that I feel for migrant women in this city. So I was wondering whether, Fazila, you wanted to say something more about your own work.
Yeah, I think for academics to work in this detached fashion and not be involved is a big error. And I think this demarcation between activism and academic work needs blurring. I mean, when we fill out ethics forms, perhaps there should be a section where not just about impact, because it's what, again, impact just serves this neoliberal university, but really on the ground activism, where researchers are involved side by side with activist groups, with taking part in protests, trying to change the system, not just through their writing, because let's face it, we write in scientific journals which are read by scientific academics, unless, if we start to write blogs, perhaps that might be read by a wider community. But I think it's very important for academics to be involved in protest organizing, protests and day-to-day activism. But I just see that very few and far in between. Academics might be involved in, for example, charity groups or NGOs, but as far as their involvement in what is considered radical activism, or activism which is much more visible and of a radical nature, which really tries to address the system. I mean, which tries to sort of, what I think this theorist who I quite like has always said, what do you mean by politics? And one of his definitions is that it's when the state and the police collide, when there is actual change. That's when you think about, activism, or that's what counts as politics. This is what he said. What counts as politics? And I think I see very few academics. Actually, I see very few people of my generation involved in that kind of activism. It's just the younger generation, or as we call the Z generation, which is involved in this, these radical protests, even in, Germany, even in Berlin, which has so many structures. The number of people who are from my generation, or who are academics, who are involved in this kind of grassroots politics, or who I see on the streets, very few and far between. They are not willing to confront the state, and in fact, there should be more people involved from academia, because they have a secure status. We have jobs, we have citizenship. So why should we think about, vulnerable groups, or refugee women, and why not take upon the responsibility for being on the streets and trying to change the system? And I think it's not enough to write about social movements or activism, but we need to be there. So for me, it's very important that perhaps I will write one article a year instead of two, but I would rather spend my time being on the street and trying to be, involved in demonstrations and organizing demonstrations, especially because I mainly worked in Berlin. And what I found it very attractive, because the structures are there to be involved more at a fuller level. And this is what I, continue to appreciate with Berlin, even though it's not without problems, but the structures are there. And I'm surprised that in Berlin, there perhaps junior academics, I might see PhD students or undergraduate students from certain universities, but I don't see senior academics, on the ground. And I think it's very important that everyone is involved. Otherwise, even the activism gets marginalized to a certain level.
I also think it bends down to, I think I come from India, and I come from a tradition of, where the women's movement is, very intergenerational,
Mm,
and there is a certain element of politics, that I had the privilege of being involved in by virtue of the fact that, I went to institutions like Jawaharlal Nehru University,
mm,
which kind of really shaped my gender politics as I went along. But I completely agree with you that, when it comes to senior academics, taking, and you see that quite often in the subcontinent, where the academics take on a public role and take on politics, and of course pay a price for it right now, as it is happening in India. There's lots of state murders, that are murders that are taking place of activists, of academics who have taken a public position, who are behind bars. That is also the reality of contemporary India. But at the same time, I feel like, I come from that tradition, and I think for me personally, especially being an anthropologist, where my encounter for knowledge production is of a very intimate kind. One cannot just take stories, and sometimes, and this is why, this was the beginning, the reason why we started the collaborative project in the first place, because we felt very strongly, me and my colleague who were working on this project, that as anthropologists, when you work with, survivors of mass violence, survivors of, domestic abuse, sometimes all people have is their stories. And as researchers, if we, get in there and try to take people's stories, you're really taking something really fundamental. You're actually, instead of giving voice, you're taking away the voice. Yeah, and that was our observation from the research that we were doing. And hence we felt very strongly about, changing the mode of knowledge production. And of course, the changing the mode of knowledge production comes with a whole set of challenges, which is what we have been dealing with, and we are writing about it reflexively as well. What happens when you co-produce, when the other is in your own space, so when you bring the other into the university, what happens, because you used to writing about conflict in other places. You want to write about Congo, you want to write about South Sudan, you want to write about Somalia. But when people from these places are in your own cities, who's going to take responsibilities? And that was the beginning premise of the project that we had started with WAST, and of the other activism work that I continue to do. But for me, the very premise was the intimacy of knowledge production, and that was the same with my own doctoral work as well. Is, when you live in the slums for 18 months with women who have been through an episode of communal violence, how do you then say that I'm only going to take your stories, I'm only interested in your life objectively, and then I'm not going to, take it to feminist forums, or take, rally for change, or work for justice in any other way? That does not happen. And I think that is where, this whole idea of, an academic activist, yeah, is generated. And I feel very strongly about it, because I feel, and I'm very, very privileged that I have been able to associate myself with organizations like WAST and Safety for Sisters. Like, we found each other, but it gave me so much meaning to my being as an academic at the University of Manchester.
Well,
So yeah.
yeah, definitely. I would agree with you there, because I think for me, it's been very important, this idea of continuity, that we just don't, because as academics, that we are expected to write certain papers and then we move on to different projects. And for me, even though it's been quite a challenge, I mean, I first started my research in Los Angeles working with migrant families, but and of course then I found a job in the UK. But this idea that, you know, that we should stay in contact, and I think that's the premise, is this idea of continuity, because once you break off, then I think everything is lost. And I think this continuity of staying in contact with our interview partners or our research partners, I think is crucial, because then you come to know what's going on in their lives and what's important to them, and how we can continue to work side by side with them. And I think definitely as anthropologists, I mean, I was also trained as a linguist, and worked with anthropologists closely. So the idea of intimacy in anthropology happens as part of our methodology. So that's one of possibly the strengths of anthropology that we do come to know our research partners in a way that perhaps that's not possible in other disciplines. I mean, in my own work, I was very fortunate that I met women from International Women's Space, but this wasn't the only group. I mean, in Berlin, I also was very fortunate to work with this radio organization, We Are Born Free. And, I continue to be in contact with them and participate on their radio shows from time to time. And there are other groups also, which, I continue to work with them as collaborators and as, but for me, it's a challenge. But I'm thinking about it, like for my next project, how to include activists and activist groups as writers as well, because until now, I've done most of the analysis and done writing. I mean, there was one article where I did include one of the activists as a second author, and she did contribute, but I want to do more of that. And I am considering ways to do that, because it's not only, I think one of the challenges is to think about their sovereignty, their self-determination, their autonomy, their thoughts, their ideas, So I think it's not only just, that, okay, you come along as a second author and you write this section and I write this section, but you have to be careful, because within academia, we have to abide by certain standards. Yeah. And otherwise, it won't be published, the journal will not accept. So I think there has to be, we have to find a way to include activist groups as co-writers. And I think one of the ways to do so is perhaps through edited volumes, edited books, which offer more flexibility. So, but there are challenges, definitely.
I also wanted to take the opportunity for Sandhya. Sandhya, do you want to quickly just tag and speak about the position paper and the report that you guys recently wrote? So that, if students or anybody wanted to use it as part of the, research on forced migration, they can then use.
Definitely. So one of the problems we have at Safety for Sisters is no one writes from the women's experience. There are mentions briefly in reports. It's usually an add-on, an appendix. It's usually just an afterthought. So, and for the groups that have that experience and work with the women alongside the women, we're too small. We don't have the policy workers, we don't have the resources, the funding. We're so inundated and overwhelmed with cases and difficulties. So it's a real challenge for groups like ours to actually provide the evidence, but we are absolutely committed to doing that. And so really against the grain, we have used this year to provide evidence alongside our original 2016 report. So we have a position paper, which I'll send to you, which sets out our position. Early in COVID, we knew this was going to be a disaster, a catastrophe, a pandemic within a pandemic upon a pandemic for the women that we work with. And so we set out our position quite early on, looking at how the intersectional inequalities sort of multiply and align to create more barriers for women. So we sent out a position paper. We did a report called Locked In, Locked Out, which was looking at the direct experiences of women under COVID, looking at the specificities of COVID upon women who are already in, really difficult and challenging and it's discriminated against. And we also set out a list of recommendations that we think our government and our local devolved government can look at as a way to alleviate some of the trauma and some of the poverty and some of the discrimination and racisms that the women experience, if the law can't protect those women at a national level, we felt that there were solutions outside of the law that could be used. So we're currently trying to push through some of the recommendations through the devolved government, and highlighting it wherever and whenever we go, because of course we don't know, power is shifting, and we're never in positions of power, so we don't know where power lies. So all we can do is say it outside, and hopefully it will catch someone's attention, and keep saying it, and keep using our evidence, because the government says there is not evidence, and what we are saying as a tiny organization is pushing back and saying we have this evidence. This is the evidence. It's come from our direct experiences and the women's direct experiences. So I'll send that all on to you. Yes, Lucy, thanks for your email. I'll send those on to but I mean, I think also we just need to also recognize that small organizations like us, we have such acute problems with providing the evidence, because we have to take time out of the work directly with women, running an organization, doing our political activism to write, and we're writing within a construct and a way in which is set out that doesn't really fit our experiences, because our experiences doesn't fit into society's safeguards or mechanisms or infrastructure. So continually we're having more work, more challenge, more complexity, and we're continually being asked for more information. So, even the production of information, the production of reports has a power imbalance at the heart of it.
And I think it's important to say that, because one also just expects organizations to keep producing evidence, but with small organizations it's not always a straightforward, especially firefighting small organizations, organizations that are based at the, like, with the International Women's Space as well, organizations that are based at the intersection of race and migration especially. It's really hard to carve out that space to then produce that concrete evidence. And then it's interesting, what evidence is then bought by the state, and what knowledge becomes, what becomes the knowledge that the state actually believes in. So of course, that's another conversation altogether. But on that note, I would like to thank all four of us. I know International Women's Space has had to quit this conversation because they had another meeting. But Fazila, thank you so much for your time, and Sandhya for your time as well. And I'm hoping we can continue to, have these meaningful conversations. And on behalf of HCRI, I just wanted to say thank you to all four of you who were part of this conversation today, and also to Lucy for facilitating this conversation. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have been in this space. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and thank you for having us, and thank you, Lucy, for organizing.